I met Will when I was 30 and he was 30, and honestly, I thought he might be my last shot at something real. He'd been burned by a bunch of crazy exes and was practically ready to give up on relationships entirely, which I found kind of endearing at the time. There was something stable about him, something safe that I'd never really had before. We dated for 3 years, and they were good years. Not perfect, but good enough that when he proposed, I said yes without hesitation. The wedding was small, but nice, and for a while after, everything felt like it was falling into place. Will had his routines and his predictable ways, but I told myself that was what I wanted. Stability, security. Someone who wouldn't disappear on me like Hugo had years before, just vanishing one day for some other woman without so much as an explanation. But after we'd been married for a while, I started noticing things, little things at first. How Will would chew his cereal like a cow every morning, making these disgusting, crunching sounds while scrolling through his phone with that blank expression. How he'd gotten comfortable, maybe too comfortable. Like he thought marriage meant he didn't have to try anymore. The romance had definitely faded, and I found myself wondering if this was really all there was to look forward to for the rest of my life. That's when I started thinking about Hugo again. I know how that sounds, but it wasn't what you think. I'd been reading about closure exercises and self-help techniques, and everything I found said it was healthy to acknowledge your past relationships instead of just pretending they never happened. Will wouldn't understand because he'd never had any real deep connections before me, just those pathetic little flings with girls who were clearly out of his league. But Hugo and I had history. Real, meaningful history that you can't just erase. So I decided to reach out, just for closure, just to prove to myself that I was over him and happy in my marriage. I saved his number under Ethel, because I didn't want Will getting the wrong idea if he happened to see a notification. It was harmless, really, just a precaution to avoid unnecessary drama while I worked through my feelings like a mature adult. The first message was simple, just a "hey, how are you doing" kind of thing. Hugo seemed surprised to hear from me, which was fair since we hadn't talked in years, not since he'd ghosted me for that other woman. But he was friendly enough, asking how I'd been, what I was up to these days. I told him I was married now, living a different life, and he seemed genuinely happy for me. Those first few conversations were exactly what I'd hoped they'd be. Closure-focused, mature, healing. We talked about old times without getting too deep, caught up on where our lives had gone, that sort of thing. I felt like I was handling it perfectly, getting the emotional resolution I needed while being completely faithful to my marriage. But then something shifted. Maybe it was because Hugo started opening up more, or maybe it was because talking to him reminded me of what it felt like to be truly wanted by someone who actually got me. Will had become so predictable, so boring in his contentment, and here was Hugo asking me real questions about my life, my dreams, the things that mattered to me. When was the last time Will had done that? I started looking forward to Hugo's messages more than I probably should have. He'd text me during the day while Will was at work, and I'd find myself rushing to respond, crafting careful replies that walked the line between friendly and something else. I told myself it was still just closure work, just exploring feelings that I needed to process, but if I'm being honest, it was more than that. The conversations got more personal. Hugo started talking about his body, about working out, about how he'd changed since we were together. And I found myself responding in kind, telling him things I probably shouldn't have been telling him. About how marriage wasn't quite what I'd expected, how Will and I had been drifting apart lately, how sometimes I missed the excitement of not knowing what would happen next. 2 weeks into our renewed contact, I sent the message that probably changed everything. I know we've just been catching up so far, but I really miss you. I want you, Hugo, at least one more time, like old times. Even as I typed it, I knew I was crossing a line, but it felt so good to finally be honest about what I was feeling. To admit that my safe, stable marriage wasn't giving me everything I needed. Hugo's response wasn't what I expected. Instead of jumping at the chance, like he would have years ago, he seemed hesitant. I pushed a little more, asking if his body was still as hot as it used to be. telling him how hard it was for me to forget about it. I explained that Will and I were having problems, that we were drifting apart, and it was only a matter of time before things ended anyway. I wasn't lying. We really had been growing distant, and this whole situation was just proof that our marriage wasn't as solid as we'd pretended it was. But Hugo kept hesitating, asking questions that were starting to annoy me. "Aren't you married?" he finally texted, and I could practically hear the judgment in his voice. Like he was some kind of saint now, like he hadn't been the one to disappear on me all those years ago without any explanation. I was in the garden the next afternoon, trying to clear my head and figure out how to handle Hugo's sudden attack of conscience, when Will came outside with this look on his face. Not angry exactly, but serious in a way that made my stomach drop. "What did you see?" I asked, because obviously something had happened. "I think we should talk." Will just stared at me for a minute, then said he'd seen everything and would love for me to explain myself. My mind immediately went to damage control mode. How much had he actually seen? Was he bluffing? Will had always been kind of slow on the uptake, so maybe I could still salvage this situation if I played it right. But as he started reading my messages back to me, word for word, I realized he wasn't bluffing at all. He had screenshots, everything, the entire conversation thread laid out like evidence in a trial. I tried to deny some of it, tried to explain that he was misunderstanding the context, but he just kept reading. My own words, coming out of his mouth, sounding so much worse than they had when I'd written them. "But I didn't cheat on you in the end," I said, because that was the important thing, right? I hadn't actually done anything physical. It was just words, just fantasy, just me working through some complicated emotions that any therapist would tell you were completely normal. Will looked at me like I was insane. "You only didn't do it because I caught you," he said. And something in his voice told me this wasn't going to be one of those fights where we yelled at each other and then made up in bed later. This was different. This was final. He told me he was filing for divorce. Not that he wanted to work things out, not that we should go to counseling, not that he needed time to think. Divorce. Immediately. Like our entire marriage meant nothing to him. Like 3 years of dating and however long we'd been married could just be thrown away over some text messages that didn't even lead to anything. I tried to explain about the closure exercise, about how this was actually healthy behavior that meant I was committed to our marriage, but Will wasn't listening. He'd already made up his mind, probably the second he saw Hugo's name on my phone. His jealousy and insecurity were finally showing their true colors, and apparently his fragile ego couldn't handle the fact that I had a past, that other men had actually wanted me. The next few days were a blur of lawyers and legal papers, and Will acting like a complete stranger. He hired some hotshot attorney and had divorce papers served so fast it made my head spin. I had to pack my things and move out the same day, with Will watching me like I was a criminal who might steal something. The man I'd married, who'd promised to love me through better or worse, was treating me like I'd committed murder over some private conversations. But the worst part was what he did next. Will sent screenshots of my messages to everyone, my parents, my sister Maya, my friends, his family, mutual acquaintances, everyone. Like some vindictive teenager who couldn't handle being dumped, he aired our private business to the entire world. My own family started looking at me like I was the villain in this story, like I'd done something unforgivable instead of just having some human feelings that didn't revolve around Will 24 hours a day. My friend Lexi couldn't even believe it when she saw the messages. "You were begging Hugo?" she asked, like that was the most shocking part of the whole thing. "Hugo? Who ghosted you for that other girl?" Even she didn't understand that this wasn't about Hugo specifically. It was about feeling alive again. Feeling wanted by someone who actually paid attention to me. The divorce proceedings dragged on for months. My lawyer tried to get me alimony, which was only fair considering I'd rearranged my entire life around this marriage. But Will's attorney was apparently some kind of shark who made my guy look like an amateur. Every time we went to court, I felt like I was being punished for having normal human emotions, for wanting something more than Will's boring, predictable version of love. In the end, I got nothing. No alimony, barely any of the furniture even though I'd helped pick most of it out, and Will got to keep the apartment we'd shared like I'd never even lived there. The judge looked at those screenshots and saw exactly what Will wanted him to see. A cheating wife who deserved nothing. Never mind that I'd never actually cheated. Never mind that our marriage had been failing long before I reached out to Hugo. Never mind that Will's reaction was completely disproportionate to what had actually happened. When the divorce was finally finalized, I thought that would be the end of it. Will would realize what he'd thrown away, maybe, or at least we could both move on with our lives. But I couldn't stop thinking about how wrong this all was, how I'd been painted as the villain when really I was just someone who'd made a mistake while trying to figure out her feelings. So I reached out to him one more time. I suggested we meet for coffee, just to talk, maybe find some closure for both of us. To my surprise, he agreed, and we met at this little place in the mall food court where we used to go sometimes when we were dating. I'd prepared what I wanted to say, how I'd realized that Hugo wasn't as different as I'd thought he would be, how Will had always been my safe place, even when I was too confused to see it clearly. I thought maybe if I could explain it right, help him understand that what I'd done came from a place of confusion rather than malice, we might be able to find our way back to each other. But Will just sat there listening with this cold expression I'd never seen before, like he was looking at a stranger. When I started crying, talking about how much I missed him and how sorry I was for hurting him, he just stood up and walked away. Left me sitting there in the food court crying like some pathetic woman who couldn't accept that her marriage was over. That was 6 months ago, and I haven't heard from him since. He blocked my number, blocked me on all social media, made it clear that as far as he was concerned, I no longer existed. Sometimes I drive by our old apartment and see his car in the parking lot, and I wonder if he ever thinks about me, if he ever regrets throwing away what we had over something that was ultimately just words on a screen. I've tried to move on, tried to build a new life, but it's hard when everyone in our social circle has heard his version of events. When I run into mutual friends, I can see the judgment in their eyes, the way they've all decided I'm the bad guy in this story. They don't understand that marriage is complicated, that sometimes people need to explore their feelings to figure out what they really want. They just see the screenshots Will shared and think they know everything about who I am and what happened between us. My sister Maya keeps telling me I should be grateful to be free of someone who could turn so cold so quickly, but she doesn't understand either. She never saw the Will I fell in love with, the one who used to look at me like I was the most important person in his world. That man is gone now, replaced by this stranger who could throw away years of history over some text messages that never even led to anything real. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd never reached out to Hugo, if I'd just accepted that marriage meant settling for Will's version of love and nothing more. But then I remember how alive I felt during those 2 weeks, how good it was to feel wanted and desired by someone who actually paid attention to me, and I can't bring myself to regret it entirely. I know how this all looks from the outside. I know people think I got what I deserved, that Will was justified in his reaction, that I brought all of this on myself. But they weren't living in my marriage. They didn't see how Will had gotten comfortable and complacent, how he'd stopped trying to be the man I fell in love with. They didn't feel what it was like to be taken for granted day after day, to wonder if this was really all there was to look forward to for the rest of my life. I wasn't looking to hurt anyone. I was just trying to figure out my feelings, to understand what I really wanted from life and love. Maybe I went about it the wrong way. Maybe I should have talked to Will directly instead of reaching out to Hugo. But my intentions were never malicious. I was just a woman in a stagnant marriage trying to feel alive again, trying to remember what it was like to be truly wanted by someone who saw me as more than just a comfortable routine. The hardest part is knowing that Will never understand that. He'll never see past his own hurt and anger to recognize that what I did came from a place of loneliness and confusion rather than deliberate betrayal. He's moved on with his life. probably telling himself he's better off without me, while I'm still here trying to make sense of how everything fell apart so quickly. I've started therapy, finally, working with someone who actually understands that relationships are complex, and that people sometimes make mistakes while trying to navigate their feelings. She's helping me see that I wasn't entirely wrong to want more from my marriage, even if I went about it the wrong way. It's validating to have someone acknowledge that Will's reaction was extreme, that completely destroying someone's life over text messages shows a lack of compassion and understanding that maybe I'm better off without. But late at night, when I'm alone in my new apartment that feels nothing like home, I still miss him. I miss the life we built together, even if it wasn't perfect. I miss having someone to share my days with, someone who knew my routines and my preferences and my dreams. I miss feeling like I belonged somewhere, like I was part of something bigger than just myself. I know I'll never get that back with Will. His pride won't let him admit that maybe he overreacted. Maybe he threw away something good over something that could have been worked through with patience and understanding. He's chosen to see me as the villain in our story, and nothing I say or do will change that narrative in his mind. So I'm learning to live with being the bad guy in someone else's story, learning to build a new life from the pieces of the old one. It's not the life I planned or the one I thought I wanted. But maybe that's okay. Maybe this is just what happens sometimes. People grow apart, make mistakes, hurt each other in ways that can't be undone. Maybe the best I can do is learn from what happened and try to do better next time. If there is a next time. The only thing I know for sure is that I can't keep looking back, can't keep wondering what might have been if I'd made different choices. Will has made his decision about who I am and what I'm worth, and I have to accept that and find a way to move forward without him. Even if part of me will always wonder if the man I married is still in there somewhere, buried under all that anger and hurt, missing me the way I miss him, but too proud to admit it.